Right, we have the pleasure now to welcome Injae Park to the second presentation. Completely different topic now. Injae just got his MVP a couple of months ago. That's the highest award from Microsoft. Hope we can hear that, Injae. And
All right,
without further,
fantastic.
It was British excitement.
we can hear you well. So, Injae, the floor is yours. Take it away.
All right, fantastic. Well, thanks so much for the introduction. Hi, everyone. So today I'm going to be talking a little bit about design and discovery in Power BI consulting. My name is Injae Park. A little bit about me. I'm Swedish. I live in Poland. I'm the business intelligence technical lead for a company called Objectivity, which is basically just a software consultancy. If you know me, you probably know me from LinkedIn and YouTube because I basically live there and where I mostly post Power BI content. I recently became a Microsoft MVP for this, which is honestly just last month. And I'm very excited to share the session with you today because a lot of what I put into this session isn't something that is overly technical. It's really information that I wish I had known when I was starting out as a Power BI consultant. I've been doing this for about 4 or 5 years, and hopefully this will be a little less technical than the previous talk and more about processes and ways of thinking. So in today's session, what I want to cover is a little bit about consulting, a little bit about discovery and architecture, and how these two topics relate based on my experience as a Power BI consultant. We're gonna try to split this into four different, it's like pieces, a little bit about the consulting process, a little bit about the first questions when it comes to starting a project. We'll talk about design and discovery, and we'll finish with Q&A, but I can still kind of see you through the laptop camera. So if anyone does have a question, it's like I'm not probably not gonna notice if you raise your hand. So feel free to speak up. I'm more than happy to take questions during the presentation. All right. Can everyone hear me? Is this okay? Oh, yeah, fantastic. It's great to hear. How's the weather like in Birmingham today? Well, yeah, here in Poland, it's already an hour after you guys, so it's already pretty dark. Okay, so jumping right in, we're going to talk about the consulting process, and a very simplified way of considering consulting is engaging with clients to deliver value through Power BI. This is a really a general simplified overview, but you can consider that there's 4 different stages to how a consultancy engages in a Power BI project. There's usually pre-sales, discovery, delivery, and deployment. And basically all projects have to start with pre-sales. There needs to be a contract, and the way that it works is we have to identify a client, try to understand their needs, and if Power BI as a chosen technology can deliver value, then we move on to generating proposals. Proposals consider architecture, scope, timeline, and a lot of other things, but if a proposal is accepted, usually we'll have something called a discovery phase. This is usually some time in a project where we gather requirements, try to understand business goals, define project governance and ways of working like definition of ready, definition of done, and most importantly, we'll try to create a backlog. The project then moves into, it's like delivery and deployment, and depending on if you're working agile or waterfall, it can look very different, but that's really not going to be what I'm going to be talking about today. We're going to focus a lot on the pre-sales and the discovery. Okay, by the end of the session, my aim is to try to give you guys a little bit of a clear understanding of the consulting process and where the design of the Power BI report actually happens. But first, we're going to go right in with some questions that we might have during the pre-sales phase. And this is all from the perspective of a Power BI consultant or developer. So before initiating project, you're going to have, it's like several key questions that need to be addressed. And these are questions that you're going to have to answer before any contracts are signed. So I'm just calling this section the first questions. And the first step of any project in the pre-sales is to determine the project's goals. I'm going to be using a proof of concept Power BI reports as an example for a delivery project. And you might think that if a proof of concept is the actual project, then that's the deliverable, that's the outcome. You're going to have a generally simplified Power BI, it's like reports, and that's all you're going to give to the client. But as a consultancy, there's going to be a lot more to, it's like what you're trying to deliver. You can see some of the goals that are on the screen right now, and any project has to try to deliver value. Value can be gained through, it's like evaluating the approach taken, whether or not the approach in the proof of concept will actually work at a larger scale, identifying the requirements and seeing if the requirements actually do deliver the value and the business objectives that you're supposed to, pinpointing potential risks and trying to understand constraints and challenges that apply to whatever problem you're trying to solve. This might seem a lot like exploratory work, but if it adds value for the client, it's something that we could probably consider as a deliverable. And it's crucial to establish this at the project's beginning to align with all of the goals with the stakeholders. And a closely related second question is, what are we actually delivering? So a Power BI project can take, a Power BI project can take like a lot of different forms. A deliverable could be a suite of enterprise level reports. It could be a proof of concept, like I just mentioned. It could be a data strategy about how you're going to be transferring legacy data into something cloud-based. It could be something like team augmentation, where maybe you have a data and analytics department already and you need a little bit more manpower. Or it could be something as simple as, it's like fixing a broken report. Now, today's session is called Design and Discovery, and Design and Discovery does not count for all possible deliverables. You don't need a design and discovery for something like team augmentation. Like team augmentation usually implies that a project has already started and they're going to need more manpower for you to, it's like join halfway. And if a project's already underway, you may not need, the things that I'm going to be talking about may not apply. So that's just something to keep in mind. But then after you know what the goal is and what you're actually delivering, it's probably time to start thinking about the architecture and technologies. I'm not just talking about Power BI, but more like what tools will be used. What's the backend going to look like? Is there going to be machine learning or, it's like some kind of data science? Are you in Synapse or Fabric? Typically, all of these things need to be defined in pre-sales. And the reason for that is that we need to get all of this right so that we can get into resourcing. Who do we actually need to, it's like fulfill the actual project? There's a lot of different players involved. It's like you have sales that usually only go until the pre-sales is finished, until the contract is signed. You've got, maybe an architect or a consultant that will go participate within pre-sales, maybe also in the discovery. You might have a project manager who's part of the project end to end, or a business analyst and a Power BI developer, it's like who's working from discovery onwards. This is, once again, a gross oversimplification because there's always going to be some projects that are maybe a bit smaller, so they don't require an architect and consultant. Maybe a Power BI developer could just work from pre-sales end to end. Sometimes it's even so small that you don't even need a business analyst, and a Power BI developer will just gather requirements directly from end users. So, it's like, I just wanted to have this slide here to show that there are different characters from the consultancy side that can play a part in the delivery. Does anyone have any questions so far? Or is this pretty straightforward? All right, great. So this brings us to the next stage that I want to talk about, which is design and discovery. So let's say, it's like pre-sales has worked, you've greenlit a project, and now you've got to figure out how to do it. If we're looking just at discovery, it's once again gathering requirements, trying to understand business goals, defining project governance and ways of working, and backlog. But what are business goals, right? So everything that you try to learn in discovery is aimed at feeding into the Power BI design. And it starts with the intention of the client and understanding their business goals, which is what they're trying to achieve. And this makes it very clear who you need to have in the discovery. It's from the client side, it's going to be stakeholders who will inform on the business goals. And on the consultancy side, it's going to be the delivery team. And for people who can actually inform on what the goals are, you're going to need, it's like lots of different, personas possibly from the stakeholder side, subject matter experts, end users, data stewards, and of course the business, the people who can make the final decision about where the money goes. On the development team, sometimes it's not so easy to have stakeholders translate directly their, it's like wants into technical user stories, I suppose. So we do need support. We do need project managers, business analysts, possibly even data scientists, a UI UX team. There are a lot of people who can support Power BI developers, but a lot of these people, it's like it really depends on the project, as I just mentioned. So how does this actually happen? The transfer of information from, it's like the business to the delivery team really just works in this discovery. And you can have three different kinds of interactions with, it's like business for as the consultancy, which is usually in the form of workshops, interviews, and questionnaires. But really, they just amount to the same thing, which is trying to get as much clear information as possible. There are a lot of cases where, it's like you need to have a workshop because the client has an idea. It's not fully defined, and we need to give proposals just on the fly of something that could work for them. That's usually what I consider to be like a workshop. An interview might be that the client has a vision of what they want, and it's a lot more clear. So you just need to have a couple more questions about what they actually want. And my least favorite is actually questionnaires. They're just canned questions, which is ironic because I'm going to talk a lot about questionnaires right now. But there are, it's like questionnaires is something that I don't like so often because it implies that you're sending things pre-canned in an email. I feel like it's always in discovery sessions, communication is very key, and being able to talk to people, even if it's through, it's like a Teams call, is very, very important. So from this point, I'm going to shift the presentation a little bit more, and we're going to go through some of the key questions to ask in a discovery, whether it's through a questionnaire, whether it's through a workshop, and how these questions are going to affect the Power BI design. Okay, so just like in sales, you do also need to identify what is the purpose of the report. And this is always going to be the first question everywhere. The only difference is that the question that we ask in pre-sales is what's the goals of the whole project? And from, it's like a discovery point of view, we might be talking about multiple reports, we might be talking about one report, but we need to understand what's the purpose of the report. The reason for asking this is, for one, you need to make sure that everyone is aligned on what the end result's going to be. This really prevents, it's like any kind of, how do you say, this prevents the, it's like possibility that the stakeholders are unhappy with the end result, and it's pretty much the best way to go about it. You can try to ensure stakeholder buy-in by, it's like really understanding what they want, and it ensures the project value. And a couple questions that you can ask to supplement this initial question is, what are like the must-have KPIs, which helps identify the business's most important metrics? How will the report make or save money, where money can be replaced with the word value? This is a quote that's really, really popular from another Microsoft MVP, Mike Carlo, who I watch a lot of. And this is to ensure that the team clearly understands how this report will be useful to the business, which is very important. Pardon me. Okay, and then how do we qualify the project as a success? I also find that this is a really, really important question to ask because the business can usually answer this in tiers. Like what's going to be an amazing outcome, what's going to be a failed outcome, and what's just acceptable. It's always, it's like great to ask the business outright because it helps the team manage expectations immediately. Like, what would be a successful outcome? Maybe it's just not possible within the confines of Power BI, and it's good to settle that within the discovery. A thing that I'm going to mention now, even though we're going to go into a couple more questions, is that discovery isn't essentially something that is a failure if the project concludes at the end of discovery. If you identify that you do not, as a consultancy, have the capability to deliver, that in itself is something that we would consider a success, simply because it's like we would not have been able to provide the right kind of value to the client, or the project would have failed, which is much worse than just saying, thanks, but we can't do this. Okay, so question number 2, Second most important question, who is your end user? Generally, there's maybe three different, it's like categories of end users who would use business intelligence reports in an organization. You've got your management, you've got operations, and you've got analysts. Management might be something like CEOs or directors. Operations might be something, it's like some specific people who work with data, but look at predefined data points again and again. And then you've got your analysts who are usually trying to answer questions by diving deeper into the data sets. And this can kind of be, it's like something that you rephrase. Instead of asking who is your end user, you're also kind of asking what kind of reports do you want? Management, operations, and analysts would have very different uses of business intelligence reports in general. Like, for example, management, it's like is usually looking at data from the highest point of view and doesn't need your case studies and drill downs typically as much as an operations or an analyst would need. So you can also assume that they would need maybe the least amount of time looking at a dashboard. So they need information, and they need information that they can absorb quickly and efficiently. Whereas for an operational report, you might have a specific set of data points that are very important, like is this data points in a good range, a negative range, or something like this. And some examples could be something like unit tracking for warehouse inventory management or for tracking equipment malfunctions. Um, Analytical reports are usually geared more towards data analysts, and you can have as many filters as many, it's like features from Power BI that enable deep diving into the data, such as drill downs, drill through tooltips. And, it's like in my experience, I find that a lot of people think of analytical reports when they think of Power BI reports. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it is also maybe the most basic report. And, it's like having a report that's, it's specialized for the use is a very important part of succeeding. Here are a couple, it's like reports and what they look like. This is taken from Microsoft Learn, but I think it's a really great way to visualize depending on the end user. The one here to the, it's like top left is for management, and you can see that it's basically got KPIs and just context and basically nothing else. There's no specific information. Here you can see at the bottom, which is a operational report. And even though it has a lot more specific information, it's basically a lot of indicators, whether or not something is going good or bad. And then you've got your analytical reports, maybe the most basic, but the assumption is that the analytical reports will have drill downs and drill throughs to dive deeper into the data. But there's a couple more things you need to consider about the end user, which is, familiarity with the technology that you're delivering. Does the end user actually have any knowledge of Power BI or perhaps Excel? I've developed plenty of reports for people who've never used Power BI. It's like a month before, it's like we had our first conversation, and a lot of the success of that project came from not just delivering a report, but training the end users on how to use the report. So, it's like it's very important to identify how comfortable your end users are with the technology, because maybe you do need to, it's like focus a bit more on training and making the report as simple as possible. For another, it could also be that there are existing methodologies that the, it's like end user absolutely has to adhere to. I know that, it's like, especially in the UK, if you have like compliance, for example, you might not necessarily be able to use Power BI if you need to, for example, input a lot of values into government websites or something like this. So, it might be that your, it's like existing methodology that you absolutely need to use is not the most appropriate in conjunction with Power BI. So I've had some, it's like clients who, it's like were very happy with just having a table that they could export to, it's like Excel, because it did what they needed it to do. And, it was very quick to make, and it was fine. But similarly, I've had end users who did not really want to use the reports at all, but simply wanted the reports emailed to them through a subscription, which is just like in a PDF, because they just simply wanted to add it to their, it's like PowerPoint deck. So understanding the end user's needs are incredibly important. But just talking about, okay, you know what? Let's I do apologize. I can't stop the GIF, but there's also a question that you need to, it's like ask, which is how will the end users consume Power BI? It's speaking about emails. So most Power BI developers know about reports and applications, but because Power BI is a Microsoft product and it does integrate very well with other Microsoft products, you could access it through Teams, through PowerPoint. There's also mobile applications, as well as Power BI, which can be aware a Power BI iframe can be embedded into a web portal. But then you've got very confusingly something called Power BI Embedded, which is using software development kits and APIs to integrate a Power BI report into your own applications. You've got subscriptions, which are basically emails, and you've got augmented reality Power BI, which you can see very distractingly on this GIF here. But maybe a little bit about more about how they'll consume Power BI. Knowing how the end users will use Power BI is very important, as it really does change not only how the report should look, but it can also change resource requirements as well. For example, if the client actually wants something called Power BI Embedded, where elements of Power BI have been embedded, as you can see here, into a web application. What's happening in the GIF right now is that it basically information from the table is being input into, it's like a campaign for discounts. And essentially, within the API system itself, it's just taking the data directly from the Power BI, it's like object and creating some kind of code to send, it's like discounts, basically all in one application. It's a lot of flexibility that doesn't exist necessarily in Power BI Desktop unless you're using something like Power Automate. But this, to pull off something like this, isn't something that just a regular Power BI developer could do. You probably need some support from web developers who actually need to build the functionalities to do this. So it's really important to clarify these things up front. Okay, so now onto a little bit more, it's like stuff that really is just about compliance. What about security? So there's a lot of different ways that security comes into play, and depending on how the end users are consuming the reports, security can be very important. For Power BI service, you might just have something like your Microsoft accounts, authentication, multi-factor authentication, and you might also have data that is not required to be secure. For example, I do know that some Fortune 500, it's like companies do look at, for example, US general census data, which is something that they gather every 10 years. But you don't really need security on this because that's just freely available online. And so it's really important to know what's appropriate for your end users. But even though there's a whole lot of different ways that security can take place, whether it's inside the BI report using row level security or object level security, whether it's it's like in your embedded application, whether it's in the workspace because end users might need to build upon some of the data sets themselves, or whether you're using it's like AD groups or database access, that it might be something that you use for direct query through, no, not direct query, live connections through analytical services where the access is handled at the cube level. All of these things are plausible, but security will usually follow whatever existing framework the client has. And then we also have to think about how will end users be licensed. This is always kind of, it's like being the thorn in my side as a Power BI consultant, because onboarding a client who does not have any Power BI capabilities is always a question about whether they're willing to pay the, it's like monthly usage cost. And it's like, and this was in the first couple of years when I was a Power BI consultant. Now it's a lot better because if you are on a premium capacity, end users might not need to be licensed. But if you're, it's like trying to understand, it's like what the licensing costs actually need to be, this is going to be very important, even though it's not so much about the design, it's more about the architecture. And then, of course, maybe a question that should have been at the very front: what data sources will be used, and how good is the data? Uh, okay, so I say this might be actually the most important question, because this is the question where most of it falls apart. Where in most of my projects, this is the question that cancels the project. And it usually happens because the client does not have sufficient quantities or decent enough quality of data. Availability and quality is really the first two things that you need to understand about the data itself, because what end users, what clients really, it's like want as business objectives might be things that are impossible simply because they don't gather and collect that data, or maybe they just recently started gathering the data and their, sample size is not, it's like big enough. And this, in my experience, usually has to do a lot with trying to, it's like find use cases for artificial intelligence, for large language models. That's, it's like really becoming a thing right now. And a lot of projects, it's like stop simply because the availability and quality of the data is not enough to support what, it's like you want to achieve. You also need to identify the potential data challenges. And what I mean here is not just about the data quality and availability, but it's also about maybe you are in a project that has multiple different sources of data, and there are access issues with maybe one or two of the different sources because they're owned by a third party vendor. A lot of these things can also shut down a project if, for example, the access rights is going to take like 3-4 months. Then we'll talk again in 3-4 months. It's like that's just basically how it is with a lot of projects. And data, it's like determining data security, compliance, and governance needs is also very important. For example, if the data itself is, for example, something that relates to GDPR, then there's a lot of things that needs to go in about, it's like the legality of, how storing the data will work, whether or not someone, it's like on the client side will, it's like be working to clean the data in order to be GDPR compliant, or if it's something that's the consultancy is going to, it's like set up. So lots of really important questions to make sure you're not in legal hot water. But then a little bit more about Power BI. What's the actual features that you're going to need to use in Power BI to provide the value? These are a couple, what you see on the screen are a couple of my favorite features. Probably most of the features that I use for Power BI, it's like reporting. You've got your drill downs, drill throughs. Okay, I'm not gonna, it's like go through all of them, but essentially, one thing that's very important is that the simple truth in my, it's like consultancy, which is not the same for everyone else, is that a lot of my clients have not had a lot of familiarity with Power BI. So it's always been incumbent on myself as the consultant to let them know what the possibilities are and to inform what they could potentially do with the goals, and it's like in the framework of what goals they have, what they actually need, and the data itself. A couple examples of something that you could propose is something like this, which is a combination technique of field parameters, slicers, and conditional formatting to really give, it's like very clear insights into a scatter plot. This is something that was created by a fellow Polish developer, Gustav Dudek, who I'm a really big fan of, and it's just the level of complexity to actually get to something like this is not something that comes out of the box. So yes, it does take a little bit of tinkering to, to get to this point, but this is absolutely possible in Power BI. And, if you know how, it's not too difficult. Other techniques also include things like dynamic format strings. It's important that the consultant needs to keep up with what's happening with releases in Power BI. Dynamic format strings was something that was released, honestly, not that long ago, but it's something that has existed in calculation groups for quite some time. What you're seeing right now is just the ability to change the number of decimals in the visuals itself. It's not something, it's like groundbreaking, but just the fact that something like this is possible is something that, if the client, for example, doesn't know about it, they'll never ask for it. So it's important to, it's like for the consultants to bring this possibility up. Another feature that I think is, it's like really amazing that does not see much light of day is the ability to personalize your visuals. So you can give end users the possibility to essentially decide what kind of chart they would like to see with what kind of data. I think this is really great because, it's like a for a company or an organization that's kind of maybe in the earlier stages of their data strategy, a lot of people might not really know exactly what's going to bring them most value. And in a circumstance like this, just having proper cleaned data and making that accessible to the end users by using something called perspectives, where you select a specific number of columns that they can use in a, it's like personalized visual like this, will actually be enough to provide a lot of value. But once again, most important thing to think about here is that these are all techniques that the developer needs to propose, as it's like just to hammer the point, and most business stakeholders will not know about these features in advance. And then finally, we'll talk about what UI UX requirements are there. I think most clients have their own company branding, which could be related to their colors, their logos, or fonts. And as a derivative of this, there'll usually be some branding guidelines, even if it's something for their web portals. And it's possible that if they actually have used Power BI a bit before, they even have something like a Power BI JSON theme or a template. It's like, especially if they're further along with their Power BI adoption. Well, this is great. It could be that branding itself becomes part of the deliverable, including, for example, creating a JSON theme, creating, it's like design guidelines for, it's like the organization to use in-house. And those are so the, it's like discovery questions that I basically wanted to talk about today. This isn't comprehensive. There are other discovery questions that it's like you definitely should ask. For example, like non-functional requirements, such as how often does the dashboard need to be refreshed? How will the user interactions with the dashboard be tracked? Microsoft recently released a monitoring hub, which has been pretty awesome to use to track, it's like user interactions. Is there any performance or scalability requirements? This kind of ties back into the licensing. Even if you're on the premium capacity, it really depends on what kind of premium capacity you're using. Because there are definitely cases where if you've got a poorly written reports that takes up a lot of CPU, all other reports in the, it's like tenant could, it's like slow down tremendously, which is very noticeable and has happened, it's like in my experience, honestly, it happens quite a lot. Will the dashboard be integrated into other systems or platforms? This is, it's like, once again, something, it's like about the embedding, but at the same time, it could also be about, will the dashboard be integrated into specific processes? For example, you can have a Power BI that's part of, it's like a Power Apps, model-driven apps, for example, which is a, it's a pretty great use case if you're creating something like a, it's like Power Apps driven CRM report or something like this, or you have an actual staged process all within the Power Platform, and Power BI is a mere part of that. So understanding things like this, it's like really help to, it's like ensure that the reports are meeting their actual needs. And what's the expected return on investment? This one is actually something that I don't usually think about too much as a Power BI consultant. But now that, it's like I'm a Power BI tech lead, I have to, to consider with the amount of, it's like man days a client is willing to spend on a project, how much will they get back? Because if you're creating something for, it's like end users who's very high up, and you're going to provide a week's worth so that the, it's like the CEO or someone might have a couple more hours in a day, that's a great investment. But if you're doing something to enable, it's like one person's manual work to be, it's like less, and the return on your investment will actually break even in 2 years, it might be, it's like a good time to ask whether or not the, it's like the actual project is worthwhile. Okay, So that was all that I wanted to talk about. I think I have 8 minutes for Q&A. So if anyone has any questions, I'm right here.
How do you price yourself?
Sorry, could you speak up a little bit? Okay, maybe I'm going to try to raise my volume a little bit.
How do you price yourself? So how do you sort of set the pricing? And maybe you could sort of guide us what would be sort of a standard price for maybe a very basic sort of report, for example?
Okay, so I can't necessarily give you exact numbers of my consultancy right now because I honestly don't know. But I will tell you this, right? So the way that Power BI consultants price themselves vary depending on, it's like what country you're in. United States and Canada, for example, have much higher freelancing costs. But if you're in the UK, I do, it's like understand that it could be anywhere from 300 to 600 to 800, it's like pounds a day. But I do also understand that in the UK, you guys have certain things that are important, like the IP35. You also have like daily rates instead of, it's like hourly rates. So honestly, I have to say that this really depends on how much value you can give to the client. I do know that if the value is big enough, then the amount that you charge will be equally, it's like large. But it's also, how do you say, very dependent on whether you're working for yourself or if you're working for someone else.
That's fair. Thank you.
Question for me, Injae. So if you go back a slide, please, you showed us a bunch of questions that you
Sure.
ask your clients.
This one or this one?
Well, both really. The question is what's your process to get answers to these questions? How do you structure it? Do you have a form you run through with people? How do you capture that data from clients?
So honestly, it really depends. Is it a client that we've talked to before? Do we know what the client wants? Because in a lot of cases, there'll be projects where I'm part of the pre-sales process. There'll be projects where I'm not part of the pre-sales process. So how much information do I have? I'm basically playing fill in the gaps, right? It's like um, if you have a workshop with a client and you know 2 sentences about what the actual project is about, you have to go through everything. You have to ask them, what's the process? What are you trying to improve? And then, it's like some of these questions might not be for, it's like all of the stakeholders. It's like we were talking about people who have very granular understanding of the data sets, but we were also talking about, it's like the people who are making business decisions. For those people, you might want to ask specific questions like, what's the purpose? Who's the end user? What's the value? But it's like you might split up the discovery between it's like the people who are making the business decisions and the people who understand the data the best or can provide as much information as possible. There are a lot of cases where it's like projects are agreed to without seeing the data for many reasons, right? But this is also kind of like this is a pretty big difficulty in my tenure as a Power BI developer. If you don't know the data, it's always hard to provide things like a backlog or estimations. But it's also one of the approaches that you could take as, it's like, is to perform a discovery as one project. So it could be like a week's worth of discovery, and that's like one deliverable, and you haven't committed to delivering something that you don't know that you're able to do. So that's something that a lot of people, it's like that's one of the approaches that can mitigate that risk.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Injae. Anyone else? Any more questions? Maybe next. Excellent. Very clear.
Well, okay.
The way sort of, as a consultant, the way the business model works. So would you sort of rather say, it's better and more lucrative to maybe do a one-off project or maybe something that lasts for a bit longer and you kind of get a client to almost subscribe to your services for a bit longer for maybe, you do something initially and then, you would recommend them that, with the maintenance and a bit of, extra things that you can add like machine learning over the next 2 years, you get like a monthly fee.
So I kind of see where you're going. I will say that smaller projects in general, 2-3 month projects are always going to be more lucrative because People, because freelancers are, it's like generally more expensive. Projects for, it's like 2 3 month periods are, it's like obviously to do those projects, they have to be taken away from the possibility of having financial stability with a 12-month project or even 2 years or something like this. So smaller projects, if you can get a lot of them, they can be lucrative, sure, but it also depends again more on, it's like your ability to negotiate the value of your time more than anything else. If you're a smaller consultancy and you've delivered reports and you have indicated that you can provide more value by, for example, it's like applying more machine learning, maybe you can, it's like move them from SQL Server to, it's like their ETL process in Synapse to really enrich their data in ways that would provide them a lot of value. Yeah, absolutely. You could make a lot of money doing that. But, you know, as a Power BI developer, that's kind of outside my purview. It's not something that I personally believe that I could, it's like do for a specific client. And that's why the consultancy helps, because the consultancy would try to find people to provide that value.
Thank
I'll add a different question. As a customer of somebody who buys in services, what should I watch out for as to make sure that I get the best value?
Okay, so it's like I'm actually happy that someone asked this question. Okay, so let's put it like this, right? If you are working with a Power BI developer and you're not sure if it's like they can actually deliver, then it's basically you're right to ask whether or not it's like they can, or it's like maybe just dip in a small toe, try to do a discovery, try to it's like see if they can do proof of concept to prove their it's like capabilities, because sometimes it's like a consultancy will it's like, okay, what's the best way to put this? A consultancy might, it's like say, here's a Power BI developer, it's like they're, it's like very experienced, they're going to give you what you want. And they do, but it's not done with best practices. Maybe it's not done with, the proper optimization. So on the desktop, it works fantastic, but then in the service or in the capacity, once you've scaled it up, it stops working, or it loads with a 30-second refresh time or something like this, right? So it's really, it's like good to understand that if you are hiring the same way, it's like you would hire anyone else, it's like have some kind of check through, it's like even if it's a technical interview of someone who actually understands Power BI on your side, that would probably be my go-to if I was a specific, it's like company hiring other, it's like Power BI developers. I would want at least one person on my side who could really tell me, is this person worth the money? I really don't know if there's a specific way that you could just, as a business user, if you see the things that you want to see and it's there and it provides you the value, even if it's not absolutely made in the best way, it's something that you can use for within the parameters that you've agreed upon, that's still a successful project for a consultancy. So if you want the best of the best, then I guess it would be about finding someone who has um, the experience, or it's like the proof to back it up.
It's a great question from Rajesh. He asked, because I'm working with him, so now you know what to look for.
All right. Oh, I hope I'm not doing something bad here.
Can I ask the same question the other way around? What do you see as red flags for either potential clients or people that you've gone through discovery and kind of started a project, and then a quarter of a third of the way along your project, things that make you maybe think otherwise about the project?
Absolutely. So I could probably speak for an hour about this, but I'll try to keep it a little bit simple. What are red flags as a consultant? The first thing is, of course, quality of data. That's always number one. Do they, it's like lack the quality of data? Do they not have enough data? Are they storing all of their data in Excel? I mean, it's like there are some very obvious red flags, but other things to consider, which are a little bit more subtle, is also things like, do you have a definition of ready, a definition of done, a way of governance that you've decided upon in the discovery phase that are just ignored? Do you have, for example, a client who, for a smaller project, is requesting a lot of revisions. If you, as a consultant, don't indicate in the contract the number of revisions which is, it's like applicable, I mean, yeah, of course you can just say, so sorry, we did estimate this, it's like project based around the assumption that we would go with 2 revisions, and that's just something you can say as a consultant. That is absolutely your right. But it is also, how do you say, building a, it's like a data project, I always find goes back and forth. You need to, it's like provide the best value for your end user, and the end user needs to be there for you to tell you what the value is going to come from. I would say yes. My biggest red flag is, it's like data quality and quantity. But my second biggest red flag is lack of access to the end user. If you're playing a game of telephone and there's 4 people between you and the end user, you're never gonna really get the true things that you want. There are, of course, some techniques like the 5 whys. You ask why 5 times to really try to get to the root of the problem. But if those whys have to go through 4 people until they get the answer, that's a really big red flag for me.
Cool. Can take one last question? Anyone?
Absolutely. Anyone?
Yeah, Satok.
Hi, Santok here. How do you sort of compare yourself as a freelancer compared to being with a large consultancy and the contract work you get from that? Yeah.
So, okay, so let me put it this way. If you're a freelancer and, it's like in Power BI and you're not with a consultancy, what is the benefit? The benefit is that, it's like, of course, all of the money that you make is yours. And, it's like whatever clients you have, you're going to be able to, it's like keep, and the reputation that you have is solely yours. So there's no possibility of a consultancy or your boss putting you on a project that you don't want to. And of course, the downside is that, the financial stability of the consultancy being incumbent to find projects for you is, is gone, right? So you do have a little less financial stability, but if you can prove, it's like your skills and your name is known to enough clients that you're not out of work, it's a fantastic place to be. But freelancing is also, it's like difficult because how do you find clients? That in itself could be an entire talk. It's like, do you have a portfolio? Do you have a presence on, social media? Do you have clients who know you, who talk to other clients who would hire you? There's a lot of things that, it's like, kind of stop me from being, it's like a full-time freelancer simply because of the fact that I like the financial stability that a consultancy brings. What would I recommend to a freelancer? It's like really just if there's ever time that you're not on a project, take that time, showcase your work. It's like be present on LinkedIn. On average, yes, I do have 24,000 followers on LinkedIn, but I do get, I think, 2 to I want to say 8, it's like requests for freelance work a month. And, it's like that's probably enough that I could just go full-time freelancing. I don't really want to, but that's what I would suggest.
Great. Injae, thank you very much again. Everyone, round of applause for Injae. Well done, we'll let you go now. Right, everyone, you can still get some pizza. We have to be fast now. It's coming to the end. Make sure to register for the next event. Do we have it up on Meetup already? Yeah, we'll put it up in the next day or two, and the recordings. Right, and feel free to enjoy the rest of the network. Cheers.
All right, thanks everyone. Bye.
Bye. Cheers.